This week, the Senate Republicans released their budget, and it would be a disaster for middle and low-income families across the state. This is what happens when we fail to acknowledge the reality that our state's tax structure is upside down and insufficient. While the Senate budget does increase funding to our schools, it does so on the backs of middle-class Washingtonians through a massive property tax swap that actually asks residents of our district to pay more than what we're getting back in new investment in our local schools. Senate Republicans refuse to fix our regressive tax code and are making dramatic cuts to our foundational programs as a consequence. There are so many cuts, it is difficult to digest, but here are some highlights. So for K-12 education, our public schools, our per pupil funding will only go up $1,100 per student, as opposed to the Democratic plan, which will increase funding by $3,100 per student. The Senate Republican plan is not enough to adequately fund our schools. For higher education, this proposal actually makes college more expensive by abandoning the college tuition freeze from 2015 without offering any additional supports for financial aid. This amounts to a 2% tuition increase in 2017 and another 2.2% increase in 2018. The Senate Republican budget also does nothing to address the state need grants wait list of over 24,000 students who are eligible but do not receive help because the program is underfunded. To backfill the cuts to the student financial aid, Senate Republicans take money away from Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, or TANF, and the Work First program. That's taking money away from poor people to help students, many of whom rely on TANF and Work First in order to attend school. The Senate Republican budget assumes a $40 million reduction in college tuition waivers. Waivers that help eligible people to pay for college. Eligible people like active duty, reserve, and veterans of our armed services and National Guard. Surviving children and spouses of fallen service members and POW MIA service members. And surviving children and spouses from fallen police officers and firefighters. The Senate Republican budget puts families and children at risk. Their proposal cuts $212 million out of the Department of Social and Health Services, or DSHS. This includes an enrollment freeze on Working Connections childcare, which helps families pay for childcare while they work or meet Work First participation requirements. These cuts force single parents to seek child support before getting state assistance. That may force single moms to make contact with an abusive ex before being eligible for state aid. It also takes $100 million away from the Housing and Essential Needs program. This program keeps people in their homes by providing emergency assistance to those most in need. The Senate Republican budget also cuts youth homeless services, like the Homeless Student Stability Program, young adult shelters, and the Young Adult Housing Program. This at a time when we have a homelessness crisis in this state. We have nearly 40,000 homeless students in Washington, and that number is growing. These cuts will make the problem worse. Finally, the Senate Republican budget has dramatic cuts to early learning programs. Early learning is a proven method to reduce the opportunity gaps for our low-income students and students of color. Yet the Senate Republican budget defunds it. They cut $57 million from the Early Childhood Education and Assistance Program, or ECAP. They cut $93 million from the Working Connections Child Care Program I mentioned earlier. And they cut $32 million from the Early Achievers Program. Sadly, we are working to create a new Department of Children, Youth, and Families, and their budget fails to fund it. This new department will create a critical shift in organizational culture and operations that will help us best serve kids and families at risk. This is a lot. It's a lot to process, and I haven't even mentioned numerous other cuts in the budget. The bottom line is that Senate Republicans have proposed a plan that will pull the safety net out from under working families, students, and children. Thank you for listening to this update, as frustrating as it may be. I look forward to sharing our House Democrats' budget with you next week, and I promise you'll be heartened by the thoughtful and comprehensive approach we take and the strategic investments we make. Thank you for watching.